Hey, I'm Bob at I Like to Make Stuff. Today we're gonna make some salad tongs to rule the universe. The other day my wife said, hey, you should make some wooden salad tongs, which sounds like a pretty simple and pretty interesting project, so we're gonna do that. But then after we make the simple version, we're gonna take it one step further. Let's do it. I'm starting with a piece of flat aluminum stock that I got at one of the local home centers and a block of basswood. Basswood is really tightly grained and lightweight. It works really well for making kitchen utensils and cutting boards. I started with a rectangle roughly the size that I wanted this whole thing to be, and then used that to start sketching out the actual profile. I drew some lines down the middle to get the handle size, and then from that drew some 45-degree angles to make the ends, or the paddles. The final shape would be handled later on. This was really just to get an idea of what it was going to look like and make sure I had the proportions correct. I cut out the overall shape on the bandsaw just to get this down to a smaller piece to work with it. But if you don't have a bandsaw, you could do this with a jigsaw or maybe even a scroll saw depending on the type of wood. I then had to resaw this down into pieces. Now this is definitely easier with the bandsaw, but if you had a handsaw you could pull it off. I've got the two blanks cut out now, and I want to make a slot in the bottom of each one of these to accept the aluminum. That aluminum bar is 1/8 of an inch thick, and so is the table saw blade, so I'm going to try to make one pass to cut through the base of this to make the piece fit in. Now, disclaimer, this feels super sketchy, and I wouldn't recommend you do this, but I'm going to try it. So I'm going to try to run this through the blade standing up on end. There's very little surface area here touching the table, and that makes it real wobbly, but I am going to use this push stick, and it has a little foot on it, so that hooks around the back of this piece. So I'm pushing it this way and that way at the same time. I'm going to just balance the top with my finger to try to keep it in place, but I'm going to keep my hands as far away from the blade as possible. Now, another thing here is that I have a saw stop, meaning that if this were running and my finger touched the blade would disappear, it would stop spinning, and I would be safe. If I had another table saw, I would probably not trust it to try this. That actually went pretty well, and it wasn't quite as scary as I expected it to be. This is basswood, and it does burn very easily, so as I was trying to take my time there was a little bit of smoke that puffed out, and that's really just to do with the wood. Nothing actually caught on fire. It was just burning where it was cutting away. But I ended up with a slot that's just the right size, if not a little bit too small, to fit around that aluminum. So I think it worked. But if you do that, please be careful. Next, I cut down the aluminum bar on my chop saw. Now you can cut aluminum with most woodworking tools. Then it was time to move on to shaping the individual pieces. I used the roller on the belt sander to get a nice curve both on the outside profile and on the inside scoop. Then I used the disc sander to get a nice tapered line from end to end. I kind of played with this and then realized that I should probably put the aluminum on the inside of it to make sure that I didn't make the handle too small. This video is sponsored by me. Really, I just wanted to tell you about my website because a lot of people don't know that ILikeToMakeStuff.com has a bunch of other stuff in addition to the videos. Each video has a full article with a bunch of other information and a list of all the things that I used, including all of the tools that I use. So if you're ever curious about something I'm using here in the shop, go check it out. I've also got an online store where I sell digital plans for a lot of those projects, as well as my book and hats and shirts and stickers and all sorts of stuff. If you're interested in any of that, go to ILikeToMakeStuff.com and check it out. With the aluminum piece in each one of these, I was able to taper them down to meet up perfectly with the outside of the bar. And once I had it completely flush on the end, I just tapered from that point all the way down to the curve that I had made earlier. Of course, if you don't have these specific sanders, you could do this exact same thing with sandpaper and a little bit more time. Basswood is actually really great for carving, so if you have some sharp chisels, you can get the shape you want out of it and then sand off the corners. Once I had one of these done, I laid it on the other blank and traced the profile so that I could try to get them pretty much the same. I did this one and got it really close, and then pushed both of the pieces together and sanded that profile one more time to make sure they were exactly the same. I got the profile for these just about done. They're about the same shape on the outside because I held them and sanded them together. I've got the cut pretty close, probably as close as I'm gonna get it to get the curve the same. And the piece of aluminum fits here in the back. So the next thing is to do the rest of the sanding and the shaping by hand with some probably rasps and sandpaper. Then we'll bend the aluminum, put it in. I used a clamp to hold these both to the table and then used a file to smooth over the edges. I used a rounded file for the inside curves and a flat file for the straight edges. After that, I went over the whole thing with sandpaper to get it super smooth. Like I mentioned before, basswood has really tight grain, and that makes it great for carving. It also makes it great for sanding because you can get a really smooth finish. The downside to that is that the sawdust is very fine, it gets everywhere, and you definitely need to wear a mask. After I was happy with the final finish, I slid the aluminum bar into both of these pieces and added some tape just to hold them temporarily. I measured out the spacing to drill 2 holes per side so that I could drive in a dowel. I clamped this down on the drill press table and drilled 2 holes through both the wood and the aluminum. This is to make sure that the holes will line up when I put in the dowels later. I was also sure to mark these to make sure that I put the aluminum back in the right sides. Then it was time to bend the aluminum in half. Now there's a bunch of different ways you could do this. I decided to use a file and make a little groove to bend over. If you don't remove some of this material by making a groove, when you go to bend it, it's going to pucker. You also need to heat this, because if you try to bend it without heating it, it'll probably break. But the downside of heating it is that you also heat the material around it, meaning it's going to bend rather than fold. Luckily, aluminum is really easy to work with, and if you bend it, you can always bend it back. So using a little bit more heat, the concrete floor, and a hammer, I was able to get it pretty straight and flat. But just a word of warning, if you heat up the metal enough to bend it, it stays hot, and it is very hot, so wear gloves and be very careful. Another good thing about aluminum is that you can sand the surface with normal sandpaper and get a pretty good finish. So I sanded it up, set it in a metal vise, and then added some more heat and an aluminum rod. This melts the aluminum down into that groove that I cut earlier, hopefully to reinforce it. It may not really make a big strength difference, but it definitely looked better. For the dowel, I decided to use an aluminum rod that I had, so I cut down 4 equal pieces on the miter saw. I used a scrap 2x4 to extend the stop block out so I could cut really short pieces that were consistent. Then it was time to put the whole thing together. I assembled the pieces and slid in a wedge to hold them apart so I could knock in the dowels. And for the dowels, I added CA glue on the outside of the pieces before knocking them in place. I thought I would try this, assuming I would probably have to end up using epoxy, but the CA glue actually worked really well. The wood pieces on the inside wanted to separate when I hammered these in place, but I added in a metal spacer to hammer against, and they went right in. After those were all in place, I put the wedge back in just to stop it from flexing, and then sanded all the surfaces. This removed the excess CA glue and made sure that the aluminum and the wood were flushed together on all sides. I finished the whole thing with butcher block conditioner, but you could use any food safe finish that you want. Here's the finished product. This is a pretty basic set of salad tongs. They're nice looking and they're simple. But while we were talking about making this, Josh and I had a funny idea for another kind of nerdier way to do this. And so Josh spent some time designing something cool. We took a picture of the Infinity Gauntlet and Josh traced out all the main shapes. This is the overall shape, the knuckles, all of the details on the top, and created vector files from all of this. He laid these all out and cut them out on the laser cutter. So after everything was cut out, here are the pieces, and Josh and I are going to work on this together. He's going to do one side and I'm going to do the other. Check these out. So here it is, all the pieces you need to make some salad tongs that look like the Infinity Gauntlet. Now, of course, I'm not actually planning on using these. They're really just for fun. Now I can control all the salad in the universe. So there you go, 2 different ways to make basically the same thing. I think this is a really fun example of if you need something, you can be practical about it, you can make it with a relatively small set of tools, or you can just go crazy and have fun. It's gonna function the same. One thing I want to point out about using a laser in this way, basically we're cutting out different pieces and stacking them up together. You can use a laser for that, but you could also use a scroll saw. I bought a used $50 scroll saw that you could totally do this on. You might want to use a wood burner to put in some of the details, but it's totally possible without having a whole laser cutter. And even if you don't have one, there may be one near you at a local library or a maker space. So don't count it out just because you don't think you have access to it. You can come up with a way to get things done if you have a creative idea. There's a million different ways that you can make salad tongs, and if you look online, you'll see a bunch of different options. This is just one I came up with. Anyway, I'd love to know what you think about these two options, which one's your favorite, and how you might make it differently. Let me know down in the comments below. I've got a bunch of different projects, and they range from really simple stuff to really complicated stuff using an array of tools, so be sure to look around. You'll find something that'll work for you probably. If you're not subscribed, don't forget to do that, and if you are subscribed, hit the bell so you get notified as soon as my uploads go up. That's it for this one, guys. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time. There's a million different ways you could do a There's a million different ways you could do a salad grabber, or what did I call this thing? Salad tongs? Salad tongs.